The 2024 Seamus Deane Lecture with Field Day was delivered by the acclaimed novelist and writer Amitav Ghosh. Hosted by Field Day, the Derry Playhouse and the School of Law, Ghosh addressed the core themes in his groundbreaking book, The Nutmeg's Curse, Parables for a Planet in Crisis. Ghosh is placing coloniality and the ecological and cultural legacy of the West at the heart of our understanding of the climate and wider crises of ecology. He claims that climate change presents the most profound cultural challenge ever to confront humanity. We take this opportunity to thank Stephen Ray of Field Day and musician Neil Martin, together with Kevin Murphy of the Playhouse and his producer Gary McCrossan. And of course, we extend that thanks to Amitav Ghosh.
I'm going to say a few words now. Back in the 1980s, Field Day set out to achieve change through the power of ideas and fresh thinking. We began as a post-colonial project, and originally our focus was on culture and politics, but not so much on the environment. It was only much later that our thinking here matured, and that is as true of Field Day as it is of everyone else. In recent years, Field Day has leaned in much more into this field. Turns out that you can teach old dogs for the hard road new tricks. Field Day now, as never before, is aware of the crucial significance of this issue. In my case, my work as an ambassador for UNICEF has brought this issue home to me personally. Look at the state of that. The poor children. When I visited the global south, I encountered climate change up close and saw the inexorable impact that it is exerting. In Somalia, I met exhausted people who had been literally, not metaphorically, walking for weeks through new deserts, and it brought home to me the most visceral way how the global climate crisis impacts on the most vulnerable people in the world. It just makes you feel so useless and so angry when you look at a mother in the eye who has just lost a child on her journey to the camp that you're visiting, and whose other children are so dehydrated and exhausted they cannot feed. After that eye-to-eye encounter, you can never be the same again. I met this woman. She couldn't, she had no milk left to feed her child. It's a big tragedy, you know, and it's a tragedy for her and all the children. In Ireland, we have an historical legacy of exposure to colonialism, famine, forced emigration, and centuries of economic exploitation as a source of cheap food for a powerful neighbour. If any country in the modern West should exercise consciousness, empathy, and advocacy on climate change, it should be us. That is why Field Day and the University of Notre invited Amitav Ghosh to Ireland. Amitav is the crucial writer who has mainstreamed climate change within the post-colonial mode. He's a foremost global thinker on how the beginnings of our contemporary crisis can be traced back to the onset of modernity with the emergence of a rapacious global imperial and capitalist system. His compulsively readable book, The Nutmeg's Curse, Parables for a Planet in Crisis, it's like reading a shadow text on Ireland, even though it is set in the Banda Islands in Indonesia. Amitav has alerted us to the vast importance of ecocide, the deliberate destruction of ecosystems and environments. We in Ireland know something of that. As Banda was being depopulated and its unique nutmeg forests cruelly destroyed, at exactly the same time Ireland rapidly went from being among the most wooded countries in Europe to the least wooded. The great poem Kilcash uses that destruction as metaphor for colonial and ecocidal damage. Cadianamage fasta can almad, tajeru naquilcha erlar. What shall we do without our timber? The last of our woods are felled. It's a great honor for me to welcome Amitav Ghosh from the Banda Islands to our green, damp sponge here in Ireland. Amitav.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here today, especially since the themes of my book really resonate so much with Irish history, with everything that Ireland has lived through in so many ways. But the story I'm going to tell you today is a story that begins almost exactly 400 years ago in a very far away place. So far away that very few of you are likely to have heard of it. That place is the Banda Archipelago, a tiny cluster of islands in the far southeastern quadrant of the Indian Ocean. The largest of these islands is only 2.5 miles in length and 0.5 mile in width. So minuscule are the Banda Islands that on most maps they're marked only as a sprinkling of dots. The Banda Islands are the offspring of the ring of fire that runs all the way around the rim of the Pacific Ocean. A still active volcano, Gunung Api, which means literally fire mountain, towers above the Bandas, its peak perpetually wreathed in plumes of swirling cloud and upwelling steam. Gunung Api is one of a great number of volcanoes in this stretch of ocean. The surrounding waters are dotted with beautifully formed conical mountains that surge majestically out of the waves, some of them rising to heights of over 1,000 meters or more. The very name of the region, Maluku, which gave birth to the English toponym Malaccas, is said to derive from Moloko, a word that means mountain or mountain island. The mountain islands of Maluku often erupt with devastating force. Yet there is also something magical about these convulsions, something akin to the pain of childbirth. For the eruptions of Maluku's volcanoes bring to the surface alchemical mixtures of materials which interact with the winds and weather of the region in such a way as to create forests that teem with wonders and rarities. In the case of the Banda Islands, the gift of Gunung Api was a botanical species that has flourished on this tiny archipelago like nowhere else. The tree that produces both nutmeg and mace. Before the 18th century, every nutmeg and every shred of mace came from the Banda Islands. From textual sources and archaeological materials, it can be established that nutmegs and mace have been in circulation around Asia, Africa, and Europe since antiquity. So, despite their remoteness, the Banda Islands have been connected to the world through trade for thousands of years. Over the centuries, these spices became extremely valuable. In the 15th and 16th centuries, a handful of nutmegs could buy a house or a ship in Amsterdam or Lisbon. On what was the value of nutmegs founded? The idea that they were used to preserve food is a myth. The commonest of household ingredients, salt, is actually a far better preservative. Why then did these culinary condiments come to be so greatly valued? The answer is simple: because spices connoted luxury, because only the affluent could afford them. In the late Middle Ages, nutmegs reached Europe by changing hands at many times, at many points of transit. The latter stages of their journey took them through Egypt or the Levant to Venice, which ran a tightly controlled monopoly on the European spice trade in the centuries before the voyages of Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama. Columbus himself was from Genoa, where Venice's monopoly on the eastern trade had long been bitterly resented. It was in order to break the Serene Republic's hold on that trade that the great navigators started off on the journeys that led to the Americas and the Indian Ocean. Among their goals, one of the most important was to find the islands that were home to the nutmeg. The stakes were immense for the navigators and for the monarchs who financed them. The spice race, it has been said, was the space race of its time. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to reach the Banda Islands in 1511, but others followed hot on their heels. First the Spanish, then the Dutch, and the English. What the Europeans had in common was that they all wanted to impose a monopoly on the trade in nutmegs and mace. The Dutch were the most relentless of all, sending fleets to the islands again and again with the intention of forcing treaties on their inhabitants. The islanders were few in number. There were only about 15,000 of them altogether, but they resisted so stubbornly that in 1621, the Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies, Jan Pietersen Koen, who is remembered today for coining the aphorism, "No war without trade, no trade without war," decided that the Banda problem needed a final solution. The islands needed to be emptied of their inhabitants. Once the Bandanese were gone, settlers and slaves would be brought in to create a new plantation economy in the archipelago. So in February 1621, Koen led a Dutch fleet to the Banda Islands and issued orders to the inhabitants to abandon their villages and leave their homes. Naturally, they didn't comply. So in April 1621, Koen implemented his final solution. On his orders, in a period of a few weeks, the Dutch effectively eliminated the entire population of the islands. Several thousand were killed, several thousand died of starvation and disease, and the rest were enslaved and deported, but a few hundred managed to escape to surrounding islands, where they actually kept Bandanese culture and language alive until the present day. One of the most grisly and gruesome things that Jan Pietersen Koen did was that he had the Bandanese leaders, they had like 40 headmen, chopped up in little pieces and put inside this well, which was later transformed into a genocide memorial by a Bandanese elder. So what happened in 1621 was that within a few months, the Bandanese, once a proud and enterprising trading community, had ceased to exist as a people. Their world had been brought to an end in a span of less than 10 weeks. The Bandanese were thus amongst the earliest victims of a scourge that now threatens to engulf the entire planet, the resource curse. How should the story of the nutmeg be told? And does it even matter? After all, what happened in the Banda Islands was merely one instance of a history of colonization that was then unfolding on a vastly larger scale on the other side of the earth, in Ireland, and in the Americas. It might be said that the page has been turned on that chapter of history, that the 21st century bears no resemblance to that long ago time when plants and botanical matter could decide the fate of human beings, that humanity has freed itself from the earth and the soil and is now in an epoch when human-made goods take precedence over the products of the earth. What possible bearing could this centuries-old story have on our times? The trouble is that none of the above is true. Humanity is today even more dependent on botanical matter than it was 300 or 500 or even 5 millennia ago, and not just for food. Most people in the world today are completely dependent in every aspect of their lives on energy that comes from long-buried carbon. And what are coal, oil, and natural gas except fossilized forms of botanical matter? The sales of this fossilized botanical matter amount to over $10 trillion annually, and the trading and transporting of fossil fuels generates another $3 trillion. No human-made commodity comes even close to commanding so large a share of global trade and shipping. If anything, it was in the pre-modern era that manufactured goods like textiles and porcelain accounted for a greater share of global trade. The truth is that human beings have never been more dependent on the Earth's provisions, botanical matter most of all, than they are today. The idea that modern man has freed himself from the planet is not just absurd, it's a dangerous delusion. Once the reality of humanity's ever-increasing servitude to the earth is acknowledged, the story of the Bandanese no longer seems so distant from our present predicament. To the contrary, the continuities between the two are so pressing and powerful that it could even be said that the fate of the Banda Islands might be read as a template for the present, if only we knew how to tell the story. The horror of the story of the Bandanese lies in no small part in the fact that the narrative of their elimination from their land revolves around a tree, a species of incomparable value, gifted to the islanders by the region's volcanic ecology. Yet, what can be said about the role of the nutmeg tree in this story? It is certainly true that the history of the archipelago cannot be narrated without reference to the tree. But it cannot, for that reason, be said that the tree authored or decided the fate of the Bandanese. These questions bring us to the limits of a certain way of telling stories about the past. The empirical documentary methods of historical scholarship depends critically on language, literacy, and writing. Its evidence comes primarily from written records. In the stories, it tells entities that lack language figure only as backdrops against which human dramas are enacted. Nutmegs, cloves, and volcanoes may figure in these stories, but they cannot themselves be actors in the stories that historians tell, nor can they tell stories of their own. For Moluccans, on the other hand, as for many others who live in seismic zones, trees, flowers, and volcanoes are makers of history as well as tellers of stories. For the Bandanese, the landscapes, forests, and trees of their islands were places of dwelling that were enmeshed with human life in ways that were imaginative as well as material. The landscape did not exist solely to produce nutmeg. They sang songs about nutmegs and volcanoes and told stories about them. For Jan Koen and the Dutch East India Company, on the other hand, trees, volcanoes, and the landscapes of the Bandas had no meaning except as resources that could be harnessed to generate profit. For them, the trees and volcanoes that were woven into the songs of the Bandanese contained nothing in excess of their utility. The idea that a volcano could make meaning would have been for them merely superstition or idolatry. Nor in the eyes of Dutch colonists was there any intrinsic connection between the Bandanese and the landscape they inhabited. They could simply be replaced by workers and managers who would transform their archipelago into a nutmeg-producing factory or plantation. This was a radically new way of envisioning the Earth, as a vast machine made of inert particles in ceaseless motion. Even in Europe, the mechanistic vision of the world had only just begun to take shape in the 17th century, and then too only among elites. The fact that it happened against the backdrop of the European conquest of the Americas was not coincidental. It was in the wake of the subjugation of those continents that educated upper-class European men began to think of themselves as the subduers of all they surveyed, even in their own countries, and especially within that domain they conceived of as nature, which they thought of as an inert repository of resources which, in order to be improved, needed to be expropriated, no matter whether from Amerindians or European or Irish peasants. But in this conception, nature did not apply only to non-human resources. People like Amerindians, Africans, Asians were similarly thought to belong to nature and were therefore also thought to be eligible for appropriation, enslavement, or extermination. Just like non-human resources, those humans too were regarded as mute, brutish, and devoid of agency. This conception is summed up perfectly in Shakespeare's Tempest by Prospero, who when he reminds Caliban, his savage and deformed slave, of the most important gift that he has given him. I pitied thee, took pains to make thee speak, taught thee each hour one thing or other, when thou didst not, savage, know thine own meaning, but wouldst gabble like a thing most brutish. I endowed thy purposes with words that made them known. The essence of Caliban's brutishness lies then not in his appearance, but in his inability to make meaning, even though he possesses the faculty of speech. In this framing, brutish humans cannot produce meaning, even though they possess the uniquely human faculty of speech. Their sounds amount to mere gabble until the colonizer gives them words, which endows them at last with the ability to make meaning. Until then, no matter that they have tongues, voices, and languages, brutes are effectively mute, like nature itself, which also makes sounds but produces no meaning. In this view of the world, the sounds of nature are not equivalent to utterances. They are the products of mechanical responses and reactions. The muteness of nature and the muteness of the brute are reflections of each other. Today, not even the most die-hard positivist or mechanist would claim, at least explicitly, that there exists any category of humans who are mute or devoid of agency. But what then about non-humans? There are many people in the world, and many, if not most of them, perhaps are indigenous, and many are Irish, who continue to believe that plants, trees, animals, and even geological features are neither mute nor lacking in agency. But very few of these people belong to dominant global elites, and even fewer are located within the academy. For historians, economists, and other academics, non-human entities are still seen as inert and incapable of agency. In that sense, their way of enframing the world still derives from the ideologies that rose to dominance in the wake of European empires in the 17th century. Within this frame, non-humans can never be anything other than inert, silent, and devoid of agency. An essential step toward the silencing of non-human voices was to imagine that only humans are capable of telling stories. This, again, is not an idea that people have always subscribed to. Many, perhaps most of the world's people still don't. It is essentially another elite idea that gained ground with the onward march of the mechanistic metaphysic. Yet today, the idea that humans are the only storytelling animals appears self-evident to those who subscribe to it. Consider, for instance, this passage from one of the finest portrayals of a landscape in contemporary literature, Graham Swift's superb 1983 novel, Waterland. Only animals, says one of Swift's characters, live entirely in the here and now. Only nature knows neither memory nor history. But man, let me offer you a definition, is the storytelling animal. Wherever he goes, he wants to leave behind not a chaotic wake, not an empty space, but the comforting marker buoys and trail signs of stories. This passage serves as the epigraph for a fine article by the environmental historian William Cronon. The article is on the nature of narrative, and Cronon argues that the fundamental difference between a mere succession of events, which he calls a chronology, and a story is that the latter joins events together in a way that invests them with meaning. This, he assumes, is a specifically human ability. Hence, he says, narrative is a peculiarly human way of organizing reality. So what is really at stake here is not so much storytelling itself, but rather the question of who can make meaning. Once again, the assumption is that non-humans cannot make or discern meaning. As with so many other attempts to define the exceptionalism of human beings, this idea is tenable only if meaning-making and storytelling are defined in a circular fashion, as being tied to human forms of language. But is it really the case that experiences cannot have any meaning in the absence of language? Clearly, this does not obtain for pre-linguistic humans. It is well known that even infants understand and make many kinds of meaning. So why should it not be possible to connect experiences into meaningful patterns in other ways, through memory, sight, or smell, for instance? Any pet owner knows that a dog understands as meaningful the relationship between the home, the park, and certain times of day. For the dog, then, is this a chronology or a narrative? Either way, it is clearly not the case that the dog lives entirely in the here and now. Its experiences are sequential and are understood to unfold in time and space. The importance of sequencing will be evident to anyone who has ever tried to write a story. A narrative is nothing if not an arrangement of a sequence of events. This is why the sentences that connect one paragraph to another are of such vital importance. They provide the sequential connections between events and places out of which meaningful narrative emerges. This kind of narrative sequencing is analogous to movement through time as well as space. That is exactly what is meant by the unfolding of a story. That may account for why so many of the world's earliest and most powerful narratives are stories that unfold through movement. For example, the Ramayana, the Odyssey, the Norse sagas, the Journey to the West, and so on. Now, it's well established that many animals have long memories and are able to communicate in complex ways. Some of these animals, like elephants, whales, and migratory birds, also move over immense distances and appear to have attachments to particular places. Elephants are known to return to elephant mortuaries. Whales, they obviously have certain methods of communication, and they go back from one place to another over years. How do we know that the mother whales aren't telling stories about certain places to their children? I mean, is that something we can just assume? As far back as the 1930s, the biologist Jakob von Uschkull demonstrated that many animals actively interpret their surroundings, creating their own experiential worlds. This idea has long been anathema to those who believe that it's a cardinal error to attribute human qualities to animals. But as Eileen Christ has so persuasively shown in her book, Images of Animals, Anthropomorphism and Animal Mind, to rigorously avoid anthropomorphism is only to risk falling into the related fallacy of mechanomorphism, the assumption that animals are machine-like creatures that cannot, in principle, be endowed with minds or interpretive faculties. In short, there are many good reasons to conclude, as Donna Haraway does, that storying cannot any longer be put into the box of human exceptionalism. The anthropologist Tom Van Duren goes further. In a fascinating study of a flock of penguins who doggedly return year after year to the shores of a Sydney suburb, he concludes that the bird's attachment to the place arises out of storying. He writes, experiencing beings like penguins represent the world to themselves. They do not just take in sensory data as unfiltered and meaningless phenomena, but weave meaning out of experiences so that they, like humans, inhabit an endlessly storied world. It's perfectly possible then that far from being an exclusively human attribute, the narrative faculty is the most animal of human abilities, a product of one of the traits that humans indisputably share with animals and many other beings, that is, attachments to place. Perhaps then storytelling, far from setting humans apart from animals, is actually the most important residue of our formerly wild selves. This would explain why stories, above all, are quintessentially the domain of human imaginative life in which non-humans had voices and where non-human agency was fully recognized and even celebrated. To make this leap is impossible for an economist or for, even a geographer or whatever. They really can't imagine that non-humans can have voices. But it's really only storytellers who have the license to imagine this. And the fact that they increasingly do not do so, and the consequent erasure of non-human voices from so-called serious literature, has played no small part in creating that blindness to other beings that is so marked a feature of official modernity. It follows then that if those non-human voices are to be restored to their proper place, then it must be in the first instance through the medium of stories. This is the great burden that now rests upon writers, artists, filmmakers, and everyone else who is involved in the telling of stories. To us falls the task of imaginatively restoring agency and voice to non-humans of every sort. As with all the most important artistic endeavors in human history, this is a task that is at once aesthetic and political. And because of the magnitude of the crisis that now besets the planet, it is freighted with the most pressing moral urgency. Thank you.